Okay, today we're going to begin our video series on the Gospel of John, the fourth and final Gospel. I was hoping to be able to get this started at least. This is August 7th, 2024, right about 1 o'clock p.m. Of course, that isn't going to matter to anybody listening to this video in years to come. My uploads, I haven't even uploaded anything since May of 2022, and my uploads themselves kind of stopped at the end of the fall of 2001, so I've got a lot of uploading left to do. So by the time I upload this video, it's going to be 3 years from now probably. But I wanted to try to get these John videos in because I've got a feeling that I'm probably not going to be living in this apartment much longer. Just a feeling I have. My mother, my elderly mother, is in a rehab center wing of a nursing home, and there's been a lot of discussions being had about her future and my future, because the plan has always been that I would move back to the house whenever Mom either dies or gets too infirm to live on her own, and we may be nearing that time. So I suspect I probably will be only living here for another month or two, maybe. I'm not sure. I may be wrong. I may be here for probably a couple of years. I don't think so. I think we're nearing the end. So I'm kind of trying to get these try to get as much of the Gospel of John done as I can to kind of get the Gospels finished, because I've done the other three Gospels, and I would like to be able to get the Gospels done and then have the rest of the New Testament ahead of me. Which I think will be a lot easier, honestly, than the Gospels. The Gospels have taken a year. I started them last September, and here it is now, almost the middle of August the following year, and these Gospels have been taught. John, however, I think is going to be fairly straightforward. John is, I think, in some ways, the most straightforward Gospel. It's the least like the other three. It's the most standalone. So you can read it separate from the rest the most easily. The others are very inextricably tied into each other in some ways. We mentioned that as we went through them. However, to get the most out of John, you do need to have read the other Gospels first. I believe John is written well after the other Gospels were written, and I believe John is aware of the other Gospels and expects you, his reader, to be aware of them too. I think John is best understood as deliberately presenting a different portrait of Jesus than the other Gospels did. From his own memories, his own experiences, he says this several times, that these are things that he remembered, that he himself experienced in his life and remembers. And he is writing, I think, long after the other Gospel writers have finished their work, and probably even after they died. He makes reference to Peter's death. Yeah, my cats just will never leave me alone. They can't. Like, they're incapable of leaving me alone. I had a cat before I got these three who was very independent and really didn't have anything to do with me most of the time. As long as I kept the food dish full and the water dish flowing and the litter box clean, I mean, she almost never interacted with me. And that bothered me back then, but man, I've got three cats now that just never leave me alone. Just constant need for attention. Boy, I wish I had a cat that didn't need that. I wish I had a cat that was perfectly fine just sitting off by herself and not having anything to do with me most of the time. Because it is exhausting. Not only one, but three of them, and they're all this way. They just constantly need my attention. It's exhausting. Anyway, there are several clues within the Gospel of John that make me believe that John is writing well after the other Gospels. He is aware of the other Gospels, and he expects you to be aware of the Gospels too. I will mention these little clues as we go, but John is clearly writing the most obvious thing is that John is writing a different account. He is writing a different account. He is focusing on different activities, different events He is emphasizing a different side of Jesus. And he is deliberately, I think, not including the information that was already included in the Gospels that were already known to him in his day. He just doesn't need to. Like that story's already been told. There are already 3 versions of that story out in circulation. And so now John is going to be telling us another version. John is going to be filling us in on information that I think he thinks is important to understanding Jesus that the other Gospel writers did not mention. As I said before, Mark seems to be focused on Jesus' actions. There's a long-standing tradition that the content of Mark is based largely on Peter's preaching. And Peter clearly was a man of action. I mean, the portion we get of Peter throughout the New Testament is a man who responded to action. He responded to authority. Some men are like that. Okay, I'm not really. I'd be actually more like John, I think. Or Matthew, someone who responds to teaching and intellectual meaning. But Peter seems to have been a man who responded to acts of authority. Like that's what he was drawn to in Jesus. And so in Mark, which is believed to be largely based on the teachings of Peter, we see Jesus in action for the most part. There are references to him being a teacher, but we don't get a lot of examples of his teaching. We do get that in Matthew. There's a lot, Matthew is structured entirely around Jesus' teaching, and he has these 5 big blocks of teaching, and then he kind of fills them in with events in between and connects them, showing the teaching in action. And those events are largely, I think, drawn from the account already written in Mark. Luke kind of combines these things, plus a lot of other material that he got from other sources, probably while he was waiting for Paul's trial and gathering information from sources in Israel, the area. And we'll talk about that when we get to Acts. So there was a period of time in which Luke was not the one on trial, but Luke was apparently with Paul the entire time, including the 2 years in Caesarea and then the 2 years in Rome, and apparently took that time to research his case extensively, more than he already had possibly beforehand. So he got a lot of extra information that is not included, that he included in his report, presumably given to the Theophilus as evidence in Paul's court case to exonerate him and, by extension, all Christians, and justify Christianity as legal religion in the side of Rome. Because we'll get more into that when we get into Acts, where that theme becomes a lot clearer. But this is a long time. And I think all 3 of those Gospels I mentioned before were written before the fall of Jerusalem. They were written at a time when the temple was still standing and the Jerusalem system was still intact. And so the warnings about Jerusalem's future were still relevant to that day because the fall of Jerusalem hadn't happened yet. So Christians who were living in Jerusalem or who had business there, relatives there, or in Judea at all, like in that land period, not just the city, but that entire area, needed to still be on the lookout for these warnings. And by the time of John, that's no longer the case. John does not mention the prediction of the temple. He seems to actually refer to the temple's destruction as a past tense event. He does speak about the city in the present tense in one part, like in one verse in chapter 5, which people have taken to date. But I think that's very weak evidence. I think the overall evidence of John and the testimony of the early church writers about it makes it pretty clear that it was written after the temple's destruction, after the other Gospels were written, probably after all the other apostles had died. And so pretty close to the end of the 1st century AD, near the end of John's own life. John also, I think, wrote the 3 epistles of John. There are later, and in fact, we're going to read those after we read the Gospel of John. The epistles of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John are so, especially 1 John, which is the longest one, are so similar in content and theme and message to the Gospel of John that we're going to just skip right into those after we finish the Gospel, and because it'll be just so fresh in our minds, and we'll be able to spot those similarities in themes and tone and concepts much more easily to make it, I think, pretty clear. Now, in either case, in none of these letters does the author specifically identify himself, or at least by name. He refers to himself. But by process of elimination, it makes it very likely that the Gospel of John was written by the Apostle John. We can't say this 100% for certain, but we can be pretty certain. Okay? There are a couple of different instances where John identifies himself without calling himself by name, and just says he was another disciple there. In times and places where we know there were only two disciples, one of which is Peter, who is not the writer of this gospel. Peter is distinct from the writer of the gospel, and the other one being John, by process of elimination. So technically, you kind of have to say, well, we don't technically know, but yeah, I mean, it was John. John was probably the youngest of the 12 apostles. He may have only been a teenager. I don't think he would have been a little kid, but he may have been only a teenager at the time of his calling. In fact, he probably was. He was one of the three innermost disciples, along with his older brother James and Peter. Peter, Andrew, the two brothers, and James and John were the first four disciples called. John will actually give us more detail about that calling, which is one of the clues we can use to infer that this book was written later, because he's kind of filling us in on a more detailed account of the calling of the first disciples that the previous Gospels just kind of abbreviated. And he seems to have been, he was probably the younger brother, but James and John, he was definitely younger than James. And he was probably one of the youngest disciples, not even the youngest disciple of the 12th period. And he lived the longest. That isn't entirely because he was the youngest. He was also the only one who died a natural death, at least we believe, from our best traditions. All the others were murdered, essentially, at some point or another. John was the only one who made it into what we would call old age. Partially, some of that is maybe due to the fact that he was young at the time of the calling, and maybe younger than the others, but also because he was the only one who wasn't violently killed. He was at the cross. The author of this gospel clearly identifies himself as being at the cross when Jesus died. He was there. He went to the high priest's house during Jesus' trial. Now, Peter is identified as having been there too in the other gospels, and Peter is mentioned as being there in this one as well. But this gospel also mentions that there was another disciple who actually was the one who got them in. The other three gospels don't mention that. And this disciple also was there at the cross. And apparently all the other 11 were not. Now, probably the reason for that is because this particular disciple was young enough to not be seen as a threat. We'll get to that when we actually get to that account, where that's 20 chapters from now. But probably the reason why John could do this, why he could go to the high priest, in addition to maybe having some kind of family connection, maybe. He says he was known to the high priest, so there was possibly some kind of family connection there. In addition to that, or he also was probably the youngest, and so therefore probably wasn't seen as a threat. So he was allowed to go into the high priest's house. He apparently got Peter into the house as well. He was allowed to be at the cross, and nobody went after him, I guess because they just assumed he wasn't going to do anything. The other 11 men may have been taken more seriously by the soldiers and the authorities, saying we got to put these guys in prison too if we get our hands on them. But he may have been young enough and innocent looking enough that he passed the smell test. He did not register those alarm bells, possibly. That's my speculation. That is speculation. That is conjecture, but I think fits in very neatly with the portrait of a disciple who was very young when he knew Jesus, was very deeply impressed by Jesus, and lived longer than the others. And in fact, not just outliving them in terms of being the only one who wasn't murdered, he lived a long time. I mean, the reports, our best traditions are that he lived till near the end of the first century, so he got to be in his 80s, 90s, maybe even close to 100, or in his 90s at least. And so he lived a long time period, and he was clearly very deeply impressed by Jesus. We can tell, like I mentioned earlier, the Gospels and the Epistles of John almost certainly aren't by the same guy. You can tell this partially because the way he talks is extremely similar. And the words he puts in Jesus' mouth are very similar. And Jesus sounds different in this Gospel compared to the other three Gospels. There is overlap, but Jesus does speak differently. Jesus just sounds different. He comes across differently. And probably the reason for that is that John was there for these events. He says many times that he was. And he's probably a young man, maybe even a boy at the time that it happened. And he's writing now, decades later, having sat and thought about this ever since. Like he has, ever since he spent his time with Jesus on earth 50 or so years earlier, he has sat every day and thought about it constantly, and it has deeply impressed his just life. And then, and I think to the point where he changes his, this is his speech pattern, it's his thought pattern, this is what just comes out of him. And so I think we're going to see a somewhat different picture of Jesus, but one that I think matches, I mean, it matches the Jesus in the other Gospels, but also I think is very much a product of John having sat for 50 years and thought about this Jesus and this time of this Jesus, and this is how he's outputting it now in his old age, leaving it down for posterity. And again, I think deliberately doing so differently than the other Gospels, which I believe were already known to him and to his readers. And he expects you, John, I think, knows about the other Gospels, he knows what's in them, and he expects you to know that too. I think we can see that clearly portrayed throughout the Gospel. Like I said, the fact that it's just a different account, just he's deliberately choosing different material to portray. And he fills in a lot of the blanks. I mean, we wouldn't have a complete picture of Jesus without the Gospel of John. John tells us that Jesus did, in fact, go to Jerusalem more than one time. The other Gospels seem to give the impression that Jesus only went to Jerusalem for that one last trip to his crucifixion, whereas John puts in there a lot. In fact, in John, most of the Gospel of John just takes place in Jerusalem. John also, and this is something that often does not get recognized, but John is the most chronological of the Gospels. John is the one that gives us the most frequent and the clearest time markers. He actually kind of keeps track of the passage of time, and it's from John that we get the idea that Jesus' ministry lasted 3 or 3.5 years, because he records 3 different Passovers during Jesus' ministry. He keeps track of time by informing us of the feast days in Jerusalem, which again, Jesus is going to Jerusalem for these feast days, which, as a Jewish male, he was supposed to do. Again, the other Gospels don't mention this. They kind of give you the impression that Jesus only went to Jerusalem, at least in his adult life, that one time at the end. But John makes it clear that he went there regularly, presumably as often as he could. Now, it may have gotten difficult as he got more high profile and he got more and more of a wanted poster of his on his name. But he apparently went there as often as he could. And again, as a Jewish male, he was required to, so I would imagine he did make every effort to go as often as possible. And John will record that for us. And so John helps us fill in the chronology of Jesus by actually giving us these time markers and telling us like when certain seasons occurred and when certain events happened. And because through that, then we can try to stick the other events that are recorded in Jesus' life and the other Gospels, we can try to stick them into that chronology that John gives us the basic outline for. Now, a lot of people overlook this aspect of John. John is very spiritual in nature. Jesus talks a lot about spiritual stuff in this book. And so because of that, it tends to get dismissed as being like just some, high in the sky in the clouds sort of hippie language. And, John doesn't even know what he's talking about. But in a lot of ways, John is actually the most practical of the four. He is, however, also the most spiritual of the four. And Jesus will talk in very spiritual terms. Some of these things that Jesus will talk about are going to be pretty far out there. They're all actually pretty easy to grasp. The Gospel of John is, I think, simultaneously the simplest Gospel as well as the most profound. It is very carefully arranged that way. And again, I think that's what comes after having been with Jesus and having spent 5 or 6 decades after that sitting and thinking about Jesus. It's both incredibly simple and incredibly profound. John portrays Jesus very much as the divine Messiah figure, the Son of God, the one from heaven, the one with God in the beginning, who came to the world as the light of the world. Not necessarily just to redeem man from sin, but to bring man back to life from death. I mean, John is focused less on, there is some mention of sins and forgive, but he's focused more on death. He's focused more on the idea of bringing dead people back to life. And yeah, that means Lazarus, okay, the most high-profile actual death resurrection, besides Jesus' own, but more in the sense of being spiritually dead to being brought back to life spiritually. That's John's big focus, more so than just forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins is a part of that. By being forgiven of your sins, you are brought back to life from death. but the focus in John is more on the death, life part than on the forgiveness and repentance and forgiveness part. John does not have any parables, but John's Jesus does still talk a lot in riddles. So Jesus still does not communicate extremely straightforwardly with anybody. Even in John doesn't have any parables per se. He has a couple of passages that are similar in nature to parables. But Jesus still kind of speaks indirectly and in riddles and makes people think about what he's saying, which is what the point of the parables was. You know, the other Gospels record the apostles asking Jesus why he spoke in parables. And he said basically to conceal the kingdom from those who really don't want it. You know, those who want the kingdom will look for it and they will find the meaning of it. And those who aren't really interested in it or who are interested in other things, they're going to be turned off. So it was a screening method. So that only those who really want to be part of the kingdom would continue forward. And Jesus, even John, does the same thing. He doesn't use parables to do it per se, but he still has the same goal of really wanting only the true followers. And then there comes a point in John 6 and 7 when a lot of them turn back and leave him. And he seems to accept this. I mean, he tells them things that they have a difficult time dealing with, and they just leave. Which incidentally follows up the feeding of the 5,000 by the lake, which is an incident that's recorded in all four Gospels. But John, again, gives us a different spin on it, and the other Gospels didn't give. Another example, and one of many as we'll go through as we point this out, that John is written after the Gospels and is deliberately telling us a different part of the story of Jesus than the other Gospels. John does have lots of allusions to the Old Testament. Now, for the most part, as we read the Gospel of John, we're not going to go back and look at the Old Testament. Some. We will do that some. But we're going to... John is an incredibly profound book. It's very straightforward and it's very simple, but it's also very profound. And I honestly think John is kind of best appreciated just starting from the beginning and reading it forward. I think interrupting the flow to go back to the Old Testament a lot kind of, I don't know, to me it just kind of takes away from the majesty of the Gospel of John itself. It helps add to the profoundness of it, the profundity of it. But it kind of takes away from the elegant simplicity of it too. And so a similar thing actually is Revelation, assuming that this John is the same guy who wrote Revelation, which I don't think is as certain as this being the same guy who wrote the epistles. The guy who wrote the Gospel of John is very definitely the guy who wrote the epistles of John. Very, very clear the same. The guy who wrote Revelation could potentially be a different John. Probably the same guy, but there is some wiggle room there. We'll get to that when we get to Revelation, whenever that may be. That'll be the last book we do, by the way. But in Revelation, we have another one of those, more so than any other book in the Bible, where the whole thing is filled with Old Testament imagery and symbolism that expects you to know that. In the Gospel of John, there are a lot of allusions to Old Testament imagery and symbolism. And I think the author wants you to pick up, or wants someone to pick up on it. Maybe he doesn't necessarily expect each individual hearer to pick up on it, but he expects someone to. And I will mention some of those, but I think a lot of the elegance of John is kind of lost if you're constantly interrupting and going back to the Old Testament to find some of these references. I just do. For some reason, it seems like, well, John is so much written as a story, and like I said, it is more chronological than the others, so it goes forward to a conclusion, whereas the other Gospels, especially Luke, like I mentioned when we read Luke, just seem to be just a collection of things that are just kind of like thrown in there. And they're arranged, by type or by topic or by category, whereas John is like carrying a story through to a climax, which the others really don't, except for the crucifixion itself. And so the others, it seems like more natural, just to kind of like stop and pause and talk about how Jesus' ministry is relating to the Old Testament, whereas John, it almost seems kind of inappropriate to do that to me, because it just seems like the Gospel of John just kind of like demands being read and continue until it's over. I don't know, that's just a feeling I get. The Gospel of John is very clear in identifying Jesus as the preeminent one, the beginning. the reigning, the ruler, the Son of God, the one who was with God in the beginning. There's no doubt about that in the Gospel of John. In fact, he'll say at the end of the book, that was one reason why he wrote his book, was so that you might believe that he is the Son of God and he'll have life in his name. Actually, how does he put that exactly? He specifically says at the end of the Gospel of John, these words, these signs were written where so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So he was very clear that this is the Son of God. This is a man. But it's not, he's tired, he's hungry, he thirsts. But he is very definitively God and part of God's, related to God in a very, very unique way. And he mentions himself being the I am several times. There are several statements in this book where Jesus says, I am something. And that I am is referring back to the original I am statement of God in Exodus 3, where he identified himself to Moses as the I am. And it says, I am he who is I am. And I am, my name is I am, or this is my name forever. I am, the is, the existence. And Jesus takes that word, the Greek form of it, and applies it to himself. And even at one point says very clearly, before Abraham was, I am, identifying himself with no ambiguity that he is the eternally pre-existing one. And the Jews attempted to stone him for this on more than one occasion, so they knew what he was saying. And there are also, of course, the signs. John talks a couple times about these signs. There are 7 or 8 of them, depending on how you want to count, of Jesus performing some kind of miraculous feat, which John refers to as a sign. And he says these signs were written, these signs in particular are the ones that John included to record. But he could have picked more. And we do have others recorded in the other Gospels. Most of the signs in John, most of the miracles in John are not in the other Gospels, and vice versa. So there are others that we know about. But he says that these were included specifically so that you can believe in Jesus, the Son of God, and have life in his name. So he has the 7 or 8, depending on how you count on it, signs in the Gospel. They're designed to demonstrate his authority as the preeminent one, as the Word made flesh. They're not just miracles. They're not just things, supernatural occurrences for the sake of supernatural occurrences. They're supernatural occurrences specifically to demonstrate that this is the chosen one, basically. Okay, I think that's all I can think of as far as an intro goes. This is the Apostle John, writing probably in the 80s, possibly 90s AD, near the end of his life, near the end of the 1st century, to believers, post-fall of Jerusalem. They were still having trouble with the Jews, though. They were still having difficulty being accepted. The temple's already fallen by this point. The priesthood is no longer active, but there are still synagogues. The Pharisees are still meeting. There is still a Sanhedrin, and the Jewish Christians are still having trouble being put out of their synagogues, their local synagogues, and being cast out of their local Jewish communities at this time. Even though the temple itself has fallen, the centerpiece of the Jewish national and religious state is no longer existent.